The vast emptiness of space stretched endlessly before Lyra. Her small, damaged ship drifted aimlessly, far from any familiar star systems or planets. Inside, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional hum of the malfunctioning engine or the soft sound of her daughter's breath. The air was thinning, the temperature dropping, and the lights flickered weakly above them. It felt like the universe itself had forgotten them. Lyra glanced at her daughter, Era, who was curled up in the corner of the small cabin. The young alien girl, with her large, innocent eyes and blue skin, had no understanding of the magnitude of their situation. Era was a child, only 6 years old, too young to grasp the danger they were in. She looked up at her mother with a hopeful smile, as if everything would be fine, but Lyra could not share in that hope. She had tried everything she could to fix their ship, but it was a hopeless cause. The damage from the battle with the hostile alien forces had been too severe. They had no communication, no power to their engines, and most importantly, no way to contact anyone for help. "We're running out of time, Era," Lyra whispered, though she knew her daughter wouldn't understand the full weight of her words. She had tried to keep her calm, to protect her from the fear that gnawed at her insides. But it was hard to ignore the reality that they were drifting alone in space, with no direction and no help coming. Lyra stood up, her legs weak from exhaustion, and checked the ship's systems again. It was pointless, she knew. She had checked them 100 times already. The navigation system was offline, and the fuel reserves were dangerously low. She had been holding on for so long, just hoping for a miracle. But the longer they drifted, the less likely it seemed that one would come. Era sat up suddenly, her wide eyes lighting up as she looked toward the small control panel. "Mom, what's that?" she asked, pointing with a small hand. Lyra's heart skipped a beat as she turned to look at the screen. There, faint and distant, was a signal, a faint blinking light, almost lost in the vastness of space. She quickly reached for the controls, her hands trembling. Could it be a passing ship? Was someone out there? Her heart raced as she opened the communication channel. "This is Lyra," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "This is Lyra, an alien from the planet Thalora. We are stranded, and we need assistance. Please, if anyone is out there, respond." There was a long pause. Her fingers hovered over the controls as she waited, hoping for a response. The seconds felt like hours, and for a moment, it seemed like there would be nothing. Just as she was about to give up, a voice crackled through the static. "This is Marcus. I hear you. Thalora, what's your status?" Lyra's heart leaped. She could hardly believe it. A human ship had heard their distress call. Her breath caught in her throat. Was this a rescue? Was help finally on the way? "Thank the stars," Lyra said, her voice full of relief. "We're stranded. Our ship is damaged. We need assistance. Please, can you help us?" There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. The voice that responded was calm but uncertain. "I'm on my way. Hold on. I'll try to get to you as soon as I can." Lyra sat back in her seat, overwhelmed by a sense of hope she hadn't felt in weeks. The universe hadn't forgotten them after all. There was still a chance, and maybe, just maybe, they would survive this. For the first time in a long while, Lyra allowed herself to believe that things might be okay. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a journey that would change everything. As the hours passed, Lyra and Era sat anxiously in the small cabin, waiting for any sign of the human who had responded to their distress call. The ship's systems were still failing, and the air was growing thin. Lyra had done all she could to keep her daughter comfortable, but she couldn't hide the worry on her face. Era, blissfully unaware of the urgency of their situation, played quietly in the corner with a small alien toy, trying to stay occupied. Lyra glanced over at her daughter, her heart heavy with the realization that this might be the last time they would ever share such peaceful moments. She had never allowed herself to believe this could happen, that she could be left to die in the cold vacuum of space with no one to help them. But now, with the faint hope of rescue, a glimmer of relief washed over her. She held on to that hope, determined not to let the situation break her. She didn't want Era to see her fear, so she forced a smile, brushing a strand of her blue hair out of her face. "Mom, when are they coming?" Era asked, her small voice pulling Lyra out of her thoughts. Lyra's smile faltered for a moment. "Soon, sweetie. They'll be here soon." It was hard to stay calm when she didn't even know if this human ship could make it in time. The stars outside twinkled, distant and cold. The vastness of space had always been both beautiful and terrifying, but in this moment it felt more isolating than ever before. Hours later, just as Lyra's hope began to fade, a sudden jolt rocked the ship. It wasn't violent, but enough to send Era tumbling to the floor. Lyra rushed to her side, quickly helping her up. The ship's lights flickered, and a familiar voice crackled over the communication system. "Lyra, this is Marcus. I've reached your position, preparing to dock now." Lyra's heart raced as she grabbed the controls, her hands shaking. "Thank you. Thank you so much," she whispered under her breath. The feeling of relief was overwhelming, and she couldn't stop herself from letting out a small sob. Era, still confused, looked up at her mother with wide, trusting eyes. "Who's that, Mommy?" she asked. "That's our rescue, sweetheart. A human man who was going to help us." The ship shook again as Marcus's ship docked with the wreckage. Lyra moved quickly, opening the hatch to welcome their savior. The airlock sealed with a soft hiss, and the door opened to reveal the human. He was tall and solid, dressed in a rugged, worn spacesuit. His face was hidden behind a helmet, but Lyra could see the determined set of his jaw and the focus in his posture. He looked like someone who had been through many battles. He wasn't here for fame or fortune. He was here because he had made a choice. He had chosen to help them. "Lyra," the man said, his voice filtered through the helmet's mic, but still strong and clear. "Yes, I'm Lyra," she replied, stepping forward. "Thank you for coming." The man nodded once, stepping closer. "Marcus, let's get you out of here." He didn't waste time with pleasantries. The man moved quickly, scanning the ship and checking the damage with practiced ease. Lyra could see the calm confidence in his movements. He wasn't intimidated by the wreckage. This was someone who had been in dangerous situations before and who knew exactly what to do. "Is it safe to move?" she asked, watching him carefully. "For now, but we need to move fast. This ship won't hold up much longer," Marcus said, his tone businesslike but not uncaring. "Is your daughter all right?" Lyra turned to Era, who was now standing next to her, clinging to her mother's side. She smiled softly at the little girl, who smiled back, her wide eyes filled with innocence. "She's fine," Lyra answered, her voice steady now. She felt a surge of gratitude toward this stranger, this human who had given them a chance at survival. Marcus turned to the door of the ship and motioned for them to follow him. As they moved through the narrow hallways of their damaged vessel, Lyra couldn't help but wonder what had led this human to risk everything for them. He didn't know her or her people, and yet he had chosen to help. In the cold, unforgiving vastness of space, Lyra had found a glimmer of kindness, a chance at a new beginning. Lyra's heart raced as Marcus led them to his ship. The way he moved, so sure of himself, gave her a sense of safety, though she couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty. Era clung to her side, her small hand wrapped around her mother's fingers. They had been through so much, but now they were leaving the wrecked vessel behind. It felt like they were stepping into the unknown. The airlock closed behind them with a soft hiss, and the noise of the damaged ship was replaced with the hum of the new one. The interior was much more advanced than Lyra had expected. She had seen many ships during her travels, but this one was different. It was sleek, designed for survival rather than luxury, with a cockpit that looked more like a war room than a comfortable space for passengers. It was clear that Marcus had been alone for a long time. "Take a seat," Marcus said, nodding toward a row of chairs near the back. "I'll get us moving." Lyra hesitated for a moment before gently guiding Era to one of the chairs. She looked at Marcus, still not sure what to think of this stranger. He had saved their lives, yes, but there was so much they didn't know about him. She had learned that humans were often driven by their own agendas. What did Marcus want from them? Was he just a mercenary, helping only because there was a reward in it for him? But as she looked at Marcus again, she realized that he wasn't acting like someone after money or fame. There was no greed in his eyes, just a quiet determination. Something about his presence calmed her, even though she had no answers to the many questions swirling in her mind. Marcus finished his work at the controls, and the ship slowly started moving, breaking free from the gravitational pull of the planet. The stars outside shifted, and they were on their way. Lyra felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. They were no longer stranded, but they were still so far from home. "Where are we going?" Lyra asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Marcus glanced at her over his shoulder. "We'll head to the nearest station. It's a small outpost, but it's safe. We'll rest there and plan our next move." The mention of safety made Lyra feel a little better, but she was still cautious. They couldn't afford to trust anyone blindly, especially when they didn't know what kind of trouble might follow them. "Thank you," Lyra said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude, "for saving us." Marcus gave her a small nod but didn't respond immediately. He seemed focused on the controls, his attention fixed on the task at hand. There was a quiet strength about him, a sense of purpose that Lyra had come to respect in such a short time. "I'm just doing what anyone would do," he replied after a pause. "You and your daughter were in trouble. I couldn't just leave you." His words were simple, but they carried weight. Lyra wasn't used to being helped without strings attached. She had always been the one to offer assistance, to give orders, not to receive. But now, for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to trust. She wasn't sure what the future would bring, but for now, she was grateful for this stranger's kindness. Era, sensing the change in the atmosphere, looked up at Lyra with wide eyes. "Mommy, are we going to be okay now?" Lyra smiled softly, brushing a lock of hair from her daughter's face. "Yes, sweetie, we're going to be okay." The stars outside the window were endless, a reminder of how far they had come. Lyra didn't know what awaited them in the vast unknown, but she had a feeling that with Marcus by their side, they could face whatever came next. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to hope. The journey ahead was uncertain, but together, they would find their way. And in that moment, Lyra realized that they had already begun something new, a path toward safety, trust, and perhaps even a future they could build together. The ship continued its journey through the cold expanse of space. Lyra sat silently in her seat, watching the stars drift by outside the window. Era had fallen asleep in her lap, the little girls breathing soft and steady. The peace inside the ship was a welcome relief after the chaos they had experienced, but Lyra couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She glanced at Marcus, who was still focused on the controls. His back was straight, his movements precise. He was clearly used to being in control, yet there was something about him that made Lyra wary. He had saved them, yes, but why had he done it? He hadn't asked for payment, hadn't tried to claim anything in return. For a mercenary, that was unusual. It wasn't just his actions that intrigued her, it was the way he looked at them. He seemed to treat her and Era with a respect she hadn't expected. He wasn't intimidated by her alien heritage, nor was he seeking anything from them. Lyra couldn't help but wonder, was he really just a mercenary, or was there something more to his story? After a long silence, Lyra finally spoke, breaking the stillness that had settled between them. "Marcus, why did you help us?" Her voice was gentle but curious, her gaze fixed on his profile. Marcus didn't look at her right away. He paused, his hand hovering over the controls. It was as if he was weighing his words carefully, deciding how much to share. "You were in trouble," he said simply, his voice steady. "And I don't leave people behind. I've been in situations where I needed help, and I've learned to do what I can when I can." Lyra didn't respond right away. She knew there was more to it, but she didn't press him. She had learned that not all questions needed answers. Still, the feeling of gratitude was undeniable. He didn't owe them anything. He could have left them to perish, as so many others might have. But he hadn't. "Thank you," she said quietly, her eyes softening as she watched Era sleep peacefully in her arms. Marcus finally turned to face her. There was a glint of something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite read. "It's not about gratitude," he said, his voice low. "It's just doing what's right." Lyra studied him for a moment. His words were simple, but there was something in his tone that made her wonder about the man behind the mercenary. He had been alone for so long, yet he had shown them kindness without expecting anything in return. There was a complexity to him that intrigued her, but she knew better than to assume she understood him completely. People weren't always what they seemed. As the ship continued its journey, Lyra felt a sense of uncertainty settle in her chest. They weren't safe yet. They had no idea what awaited them at the outpost, or if the rebels were still hunting them. But for the first time in weeks, Lyra allowed herself to believe that there might be a future beyond survival. With Marcus at the helm, they might have a chance. But trust, she knew, had to be earned. And for now, she would watch, listen, and keep her guard up. She had learned that lesson the hard way. As the stars stretched on before them, Lyra felt a flicker of hope stir within her. They were moving towards something, even if they didn't know exactly what that something was. But whatever it was, she knew they wouldn't be facing it alone. Not anymore. The ship glided smoothly through the vast emptiness of space, the stars twinkling outside the windows. Lyra sat in the quiet cockpit, watching as the miles stretched between them and the planet they had just left. Era was still asleep in the corner, her small form curled up in a blanket, safe for now. But Lyra's mind was far from at ease. They weren't out of danger yet. They had only escaped one threat, and the unknown still loomed ahead. The distant space station that Marcus had mentioned was just within reach, but there was no guarantee that it would be a sanctuary. Lyra had been in the galaxy long enough to know that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. She glanced at Marcus, who was focused on the controls, his expression unreadable as usual. "So, what now?" she asked, breaking the silence. Marcus didn't look away from the controls. "We get to the station, resupply, and figure out our next move. The rebels are still out there, and they'll be looking for you." Lyra nodded, her fingers tightening slightly around the armrest. She hadn't forgotten the rebels' attack, or the brutal way they had nearly torn her life apart. But she couldn't allow herself to be consumed by fear. Not anymore. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice softer now. "What do you want out of all this?" Marcus finally turned to her, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in hours. There was a moment of silence before he spoke, his tone calm but with an edge of something deeper, something Lyra hadn't yet figured out. "I want to survive," he said simply. "That's all I've ever wanted." Lyra didn't reply at first. She wasn't sure what to make of his answer. It was honest, but it felt incomplete. She had learned to read people's intentions over the years, but Marcus remained an enigma. His actions showed that he cared, more than he was letting on. But she still didn't know why he had helped her and Era in the first place. It didn't make sense. "Why us?" she asked again, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Why help us when you could have just walked away?" Marcus let out a long breath, his hand still steady on the controls. "Sometimes it's not about choosing who to help. Sometimes you just do what you can when you can." Lyra was silent, thinking about his words. There was no doubt that Marcus was a man of action, not words. But even with that, there was something about him, something she couldn't shake. His quiet resolve reminded her of a time when she, too, had been forced to fight for what mattered most. He had risked everything for them, and that act of kindness meant more than he probably realized. Just as Lyra was about to speak again, Eris stirred in the corner, stretching her small arms above her head. Her sleepy eyes blinked open, and she smiled when she saw her mother. "Mommy," Eris said, her voice soft and filled with innocence. "Where are we going?" Lyra smiled warmly, standing up to kneel beside her daughter. "We're going to a place where we can be safe. We'll rest and figure things out from there." Era nodded, her face lighting up. "Will we be okay?" Lyra's heart tightened, and for a moment she hesitated. The world they had known was gone, and the future was uncertain. But she had to protect her daughter, had to give her the reassurance she needed. "Yes, sweetie," Lyra said, her voice steady. "We'll be okay." Marcus, who had been silently observing the exchange, turned his attention back to the controls. He didn't say anything, but Lyra could sense the subtle shift in the air. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finding something worth fighting for, something worth believing in again. The station loomed ahead, a distant silhouette against the backdrop of stars. They weren't out of the woods yet, but for the first time in a long time, Lyra allowed herself to hope. She had her daughter, she had Marcus, and together, they had a chance. As the ship closed in on the station, Lyra leaned back in her seat, ready for whatever came next. They were still moving forward, one step closer to safety, and maybe, just maybe, a new beginning. The space station grew larger in the viewport as the ship approached, its structure appearing more like a fortress than a refuge. It wasn't the sleek, beautiful design of an empire, but a place built for survival. Dark, metallic walls with blinking lights surrounded the station, and the distant hum of engines echoed through the ship's hull. Lyra stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the station as they drew closer. She could feel the weight of her decision pressing on her. This place might provide safety for now, but what would happen after? She had no way of knowing who controlled the station, or what their intentions were. Trust was a fragile thing, especially in this part of the galaxy. "We'll be docking soon," Marcus said, his voice calm but edged with caution. "Stay close. I don't know what kind of reception we'll get." Lyra nodded, her hand resting on Era's shoulder. The young girl had become quiet again, sensing the tension in the air. "We'll be all right," Lyra whispered to her daughter, trying to convince herself as much as Era. The ship's engine slowed, and Marcus expertly guided the ship toward a docking bay. A series of beeps and hisses signaled the ship's final approach, and soon they were tethered to the station. The quiet hum of the ship was replaced by the sound of the airlock's mechanical doors opening. Marcus stood up, his movements sure and practiced. "Ready?" he asked, looking back at Lyra. She didn't answer immediately. Her heart was heavy with uncertainty, but she forced herself to nod. They had no other choice but to move forward. They couldn't stay in the cold vacuum of space forever. With a deep breath, Lyra followed Marcus down the narrow corridor. Era held tightly to her hand, her small fingers gripping her mother's with a force that showed her own nervousness. The station was eerily quiet, with only the sound of their footsteps echoing through the metal hallways. As they rounded a corner, they were met by a tall figure. The man was dressed in a worn military-style uniform, his face hardened by years of experience. He eyed them cautiously as they approached, his gaze lingering on Lyra and Era. "I'm Captain Ral," he said, his voice rough. "What brings you to our station?" Marcus stepped forward, his tone polite but firm. "We need a place to rest and resupply. We're not looking for trouble." Captain Ral didn't say anything at first, his eyes moving over Marcus before finally focusing on Lyra. His expression softened ever so slightly when he saw Era clinging to her mother. "All right, we can give you some shelter. But I'll need to take a look at your ship," Ral said, glancing back toward the docked vessel. Lyra held her breath. They had been through so much already, and now she had to trust this man. She knew they had no choice but to comply, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this station than met the eye. Who was Captain Ral really, and what did he expect in return for offering them shelter? Marcus gave a quick nod, as if he had expected this. "Of course. "We're not hiding anything." The captain motioned for them to follow him as he led them through the station's labyrinthine hallways. The deeper they went, the more Lyra felt a strange sense of discomfort settle in her chest. It wasn't just the cold, sterile environment of the station. It was something else, a subtle, unsettling feeling that something was being hidden from them. Finally, they arrived at a small, dimly lit room with a table and chairs. The captain motioned for them to sit. "I'll have someone take a look at your ship. In the meantime, you're welcome to rest here." Lyra and Era took their seats, though the unease in Lyra's stomach refused to subside. Marcus remained standing, his eyes scanning the room, always alert. It was clear that he wasn't entirely trusting of this place either. "Is there anyone else here?" Lyra asked, her voice quiet but firm. Captain Rel's eyes flickered briefly before he answered. "We're a small group, just enough to keep the station running. You won't find much in the way of luxury here, but it's safe for now." Lyra wasn't convinced, but she didn't press him further. They had to play along for now. She needed to learn more, but for the moment, they had a roof over their heads. As the captain left to check on their ship, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that their arrival at the station was no coincidence. There was something about this place, about Captain Rel, that didn't sit right with her. The danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. She turned to Marcus, who had been watching her carefully. "We have to stay alert. There's more to this station than they're telling us." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "I agree. But for now, we rest. We can't fight everything at once." The hours spent in the small room felt like days to Lyra. The air in the station was thick with tension, and though they were no longer drifting in space, a feeling of unease still weighed heavily on her. She couldn't shake the thought that they had just walked into a place that wasn't as simple as it seemed. The people here, and especially Captain Rel, were hiding something. Era had finally fallen asleep in the corner of the room, her small body curled up in a blanket. Lyra watched her daughter sleep, wishing she could feel more at peace. The gentle rise and fall of Era's chest was a comfort, but it didn't erase the nagging questions in Lyra's mind. Marcus, ever the quiet observer, was standing near the door, his arms crossed, looking out at the dimly lit hallway. His eyes were sharp, scanning everything. He seemed as alert as ever, though he hadn't spoken much since they had arrived at the station. Lyra stood up, walking over to the small window that overlooked the docking bay. The station was still bustling outside, with ships coming and going, but nothing felt right. The people here seemed too cautious, too reserved. She knew that their ship needed repairs, but they hadn't yet been offered a clear timeline or any help in finding a solution. "What do you think?" Lyra asked softly, turning to Marcus. "Do you think this station is really safe?" Marcus finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I think we've made it this far. But we can't ignore the fact that something's off. We don't know these people, and we don't know who else might be watching us." Lyra nodded, her suspicions growing stronger. The captain had been too quick to offer help, too eager to get them settled. She knew that something was being kept from them, but she couldn't figure out what it was. Still, she couldn't afford to dwell on it too long. They needed rest, and they needed to figure out their next move. "We'll keep a low profile for now," Lyra said. "We'll wait until the repairs are done, and then we'll leave. We don't need to be here any longer than necessary." Marcus nodded. "Agreed, but keep your guard up." As they spoke, a voice came over the intercom, startling both of them. "Lyra, Marcus, your ship is ready for inspection. Please head to docking bay 3. Lyra exchanged a glance with Marcus. The tone of the voice was official, but it sounded almost too polite, too controlled. Something about it made Lyra's skin crawl. But they had no choice but to follow the instructions. She gathered Era in her arms, and Marcus led the way down the narrow hall. The hallway was quieter than before, the usual sounds of station life muted. Lyra couldn't help but notice the lack of activity, the stillness in the air. They passed a few people, but most of them didn't seem to acknowledge their presence. It was as if the station itself was holding its breath. When they reached Docking Bay 3, the door slid open with a soft hiss. There, standing by their ship, was Captain Rao. He looked at them with a measured expression, his arms crossed over his chest. "The ship has been checked," he said. "It's mostly functional, but there are some minor adjustments that need to be made. You'll be able to leave as soon as the work is done." Lyra stepped forward, trying to read his face. "What's the real reason you're helping us?" she asked, her voice steady. She wasn't going to play games anymore. Captain Rao didn't flinch. "I told you before, we don't leave people stranded. It's as simple as that." But Lyra didn't believe him. She could feel the weight of his words, but they didn't add up. The more time she spent here, the more questions arose. She wanted to trust him, wanted to believe that they had finally found safety. But trust had to be earned, and this station, and its inhabitants, still felt like a mystery to her. As Marcus and Lyra walked back to their ship, the door sliding shut behind them, she let out a slow breath. The station might provide temporary safety, but Lyra knew that their journey was far from over. There was a world beyond this station, filled with unknowns, dangers, and the hope for a new beginning. They had survived this far, and together they would continue.